Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Critic Reading Writing. My name is Acto Quason and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. This episode will focus on the ontological leakages and transpositions in Ben Okri's The Famished Road. To turn from what the crows said that we encountered in our previous episode to The Famished Road is to be forced into a major readjustment regarding the primary sources for magical realism. From the Africanist perspective represented by Nigerian Ben Okri, magical realism turns on forms of African orality and the techniques and devices that it provisions for the enchantment of the familiar. The enchantment of the familiar, however, does not merely denote the investment of the everyday with fantasy, but the assessment that there is more to the ordinary than meets the eye, and that the phenomenal world has an important continuing impact on the way everyday reality unfolds. The world is believed to be inherently liminal and thus requires that people be prepared for dualities, contradictions, and the essential changeablity of things. In traditional African societies, this implies a belief in animist materialism, or that the world is infused by the presence of the ancestors and the worlds of the yet-unborn in sometimes volatile proximity to reality. This is what we see encapsulated in the ontological leakages and transpositions of Ben Okri's The Famished Road. Okri's novel, first published in 1991, derives its magical realist energy from the concept of Abiku and draws on a mythopoetic framework whose resources lie in oral traditions of storytelling that had themselves infused the work of earlier Nigerian writers such as Dio Fagungwa, Amos Tutuola, and Wole Soyinka, among various others. The inherent polysemy of African oral discourse is what gives them their distinctive character and from which Okri draws inspiration for his own novel. In The Famished Road, not only are setting and characterization shown to be dissented and fractured, but narratorial agency itself is surrendered to a character who is not unified in terms of our ordinary knowledge of human beings. All the events in the novel are narrated in the first person by Azaro, an Abiku child who retains ties with his spirit companions and has access to both the real world and that of the spirits. The belief regarding the Abiku phenomenon is widespread in southern Nigeria and refers to a child who is trapped in a cycle of births, deaths, and rebirths. The phenomenon has already had literary treatment in the writings of Wole Soyinka, J. Pepe Clark, and Chinua Achebe. For Azaro, the problem is that he does not always enter or exit these realms through acts of his own volition, and the matter is often entirely out of his control. Rather, a spirit potential is posited as inhering in all things, and this potential is shown to manifest itself arbitrarily. Because the narrative is focalized through the consciousness of the Abiku child, who is himself radically dissented, the whole work has a shifting and unsettling quality that oscillates between two distinctive ontological domains. Because Azaro desires to remain in the real world, while at the same time refusing to break links with that of his spirit companions, both spaces are rendered equivalent in his experience and within the narration in general. This makes for a fundamentally different texture to the novel's magical realism from what we see in What the Crow Said, and indeed in any other magical realist text. For the Abiku concept is used by Okri to import the full range of ethnographic and cultural implications deriving from the African idea of the volatile proximity of the world of spirits to that of the living. As a chronotype of spatial traversal, as we saw in the episode on Amos Tutuola's My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, the chronotype of the Famished Road in the novel's title has multivalent implications. On the one hand, it establishes an umbilical connection to the genesis of creation itself, as hinted at in the very first sentence of the novel. In the beginning, there was a river. The river became a road, and the road branched out to the whole world. It is because the road was once a river that it branched out to the road and remains always hungry. Later in the novel, a story is told that links the road's hunger for appeasement to it having been reduced from a ravenous god to a mere belly. It is not by accident that Azaro is persistently on the move, with an itinerary that traverses the spaces of both real and spirit worlds. But this hunger for movement is also a hunger for completion and meaning, something that the novel suggests is unattainable. For one thing, given its genealogy in the once upon a time of mythical beginnings, the road is unending. Furthermore, it always has 2 or possibly 4 sides to it, all of which manifest themselves from different standpoints: the 2 edges, the surface, and the underbelly. Thus, in the Famished Road, the road itself is hungry, as well as transferring its existential hunger onto human beings. And it ensures that any kind of closure remains highly elusive, even if always desired. The Abiku centrism of the novel and the fact that the narrative oscillates rapidly between the real world and that of spirits also means that all the spatial dynamics of the novel are governed by an essential anamorphism, unlike what we saw in What the Crow Said in our last episode. Entry into the esoteric sphere is not cued through any special spatial markers of differentiation, making it starkly different from what we find in the universe of, say, Amos Tutuola's novels. Rather, the Abiku steps in and out of the esoteric world without any warning whatsoever. The lack of clear spatial markings also means that there is no clear gateway or portal effect to the entry into the esoteric realm, also rendering it dissimilar to what we see in portal fantasies such as Alice in Wonderland or the Chronicles of Narnia. Most important, however, is that the 2 spatio-temporal domains of the esoteric and the real also come to cross-animate each other, so that the real world sustains suspicions of the esoteric and vice versa. An incident from the novel may be used to illustrate this. Azaro decides to depart to the spirit world with a 3-headed spirit in protest at being flogged by his father. He refuses all food and falls progressively into a trance until it is impossible to wake him up. He journeys with the 3-headed spirit in a spirit world in which they encounter people building a highway. They finally come to a river on which there is a canoe guarded by an old woman with the feet of a lioness. However, his parents are desperate to revive him, and after a few days solicit the help of a fetish priestess. The entire episode is striking in that every gesture of his parents and the priestess is simultaneously calibrated with events in the spirit world. The ending of the section is significant in this respect. The weapon of the old woman with the feet of a lioness had become golden red. One of the heads of the spirit had rolled onto the river of mirrors, and its eyes stared at the eternity of reflections in a bad-tempered astonishment. That knife, full of reflections, was lifted above me as if I were to be the sacrificial victim of my own birth. I screamed. The knife in that hand descended swiftly, slashed the air twice. The herbalist released a piercing cry. The old woman struck the spirit at the same moment with a mighty swipe of her weapon. Dad slashed the chicken's throat. The old woman severed the spirit's last head. The spirit fought vainly in the canoe as the chicken twitched. Its blood dripped on my forehead. The herbalist fell silent. The spirit's head, landing on silver, looked around, saw itself separated from its body, and let out its final scream of horror, cracking the surface of the river. The mirror shattered. It became dark. Splinters and reflections caught in my eyes. In this scene, there's a rapid translation of events between the spirit world and the real world, and the reader is oriented to the two simultaneously. There's a dreamlike quality to the whole incident, and it seems to be a fertile adumbration of the relationship between dream stimuli and dream work. The implications of this scene exceed such an explanation, however. Here, the reader is placed in a position where they can perceive the operations in both realms simultaneously, almost giving them a visionary privilege in having access to dimensions of the incident unavailable to Azaru's parents. But this also means that there is a continual inter-substantiation of the two dimensions of existence that is not always evident to the senses, especially to his parents. The implication of this is that Azaru, and by extension the whole of nature, is located on a kaleidoscopically moving space-time in which the same space can be arbitrarily relocated in either world at any point in time. In the Famished Road, the potential intersubstantiation of worlds derives from a postulation of a spiritual physical duality inherent to all things. Throughout all the myriad real-life events that take place within the novel, no specific time indices are given, nor are spatial distances clearly mapped out except in relation to the feelings and perceptions of the child narrator. All the time indices are vague references to that night, the next morning, during that time, and so on. Because we are not given indication of what length of time each event spans, it is difficult, if not impossible, to define the relative duration of each event. Narratologists have mapped out how duration is grasped by the reader, linking it to the relationship between the clock time consumed in reading a passage and the temporal frame given by the passage itself. If 300 years is plotted in 3 paragraphs, it signals a short duration and the telescoping of a long time span. The lavish description of an hour's incident in 30 pages shows a long duration slowing down the pace of the narrative. In the Famished Road, however, the lack of definite temporal and spatial indices in relation to events in either the spirit or the real worlds ensures that a mode of equivalence is insinuated as definitive of the relationships between various spatiotemporal domains. In other words, no space or time is subordinated to another in terms of temporal duration. While the Famished Road is vaguely indexical of Nigerian history just before independence, it ruffles this indexicality in at least two cardinal ways. For unlike the African novels published in the era of decolonization, such as Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Kamara Laye's The African Child, the Famished Road does not provide us with any cultural ethnography of hope. Rather, there's a sense of ambient unease that is generated from the fact that Azaro is always exposed to variant esoteric spirits, not all of which appear to wish him well. More importantly, the struggles for survival that both his mother and father must go through suggest a later phase of African postcolonial malaise, most clearly marked by the existentialist novels of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Aikwe Ama, Yambo Ologwem, and Wole Soyinka, among others. It is as if Okri has set his novel in the pre-independence period of the late 1950s, but has transferred the structural feeling of hopelessness of the late 1960s and 1970s onto the earlier phase, thus fundamentally altering the affective structure of the period of decolonization. There is an explanation for this, but this requires us to move from indexicality to iconicity. In the particular case of Nigeria, the euphoria of decolonization was rapidly replaced by disillusionment and a questioning of the viability of the nation state in its contemporary constitution. The events leading up to and including the Biafra War of 1966 to 1970 in Nigeria is a clear indication of the extent to which the viability of this great nation state was questioned. For Okri and his generation growing up in a post-independence Nigeria, the euphoria of decolonization was not available to fall back on. All that they inherited was a bewildering sense of absent opportunities. Furthermore, the pervasiveness of corruption and graft in social and political life deepened the sense of disillusionment even further. The stories that circulated in the 1970s and 1980s about embezzlement in the country have their literary treatment in Okri's Disparities, a story which tells of the pauperized existence of the narrator in the painful knowledge that a Nigerian state official has forgotten £250,000 on a cab seat in London. Okri had a particularly bitter taste of the effects of the potential disruptiveness of corruption in Nigeria due to growing up in the ghettos of Lagos, where social amenities were always uncertain and people were forever at the mercy of their landlords. The state of corruption in his country made it impossible to write about events using the same rationalism of prevailing protocols of representation. What I have so far described as the indexical and the iconic may also be taken as representing two different modes for representing space and time. As we saw in What the Crow Said, the indexical is what we normally associate with realism and with everyday expectations of space and time in the quotidian world. When you are crossing a road, you don't expect a chasm to open up right in the middle of it and for you to suddenly be swallowed up into the belly of the road. If that were to happen, you would attribute it to your mind playing games with you, some form of hallucination or schizophrenia. The iconic, on the other hand, ascribes symbolic significance to ordinary spatiotemporal categories, inviting us to see them as signifying something more than what we experience through our senses. Iconicity is often reserved for specially designated spaces, such as the synagogue, mosque, or church, which when we enter demarcates a zone of the sacred that is suspended from the vulgarity of ordinary space and time. For magical realism, the point is not to see the iconic as a suspension of the indexical, but rather as inextricably intertwined with it. This is central to the spatial logics of magical realism, and it instructs us to be always open to the potential for ontological transformation that is always inherent in the very structure of everyday life. If this transformation is experienced slowly by us in the mode of decay, aging, and material change, magical realism magnifies the latency of transformation and delineates it for us through the pairing, juxtaposition, and interlacing of different ontological domains. Thus, both what the crow said and the Famished Road may be seen as providing two signal templates for the collocation of such ontological domains. And in this, they highlight for us a central principle of the spatial logics of magical realism in general. To quote Franz Roh, writing in the early 20th century on post-expressionist art as a form of what he termed the magically real. Magical realism seeks to endow the viewer, who is frequently too cursory and careless in his knowledge of the world and in his idealism, with a penetrating and meticulous lucidity. The invitation is to look anew and with a different form of attentiveness. Thank you. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give it a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.